Very warm welcome after the actually 2 month summer break. We are back with our monthly forest restoration talks, a talk series that is jointly organized by the Superb project and the former IUFRO task force transforming forest landscape for future climates and human well-being. And today we will focus on the human dimensions of forest restoration. And you can see our two keynote speakers here, but we have some very nice surprises for you. We also have a very high-level panel that will show us different facets of human dimension of forest landscape restoration. And they will also talk about stakeholder engagement, some experiences with diverging perspectives on forest landscape restoration, and also a lot of other things that they will discuss with each other and with you. So next slide, please. You are always encouraged to raise your to put a question in the Q&A, even when the speakers are still talking, and then we will pick up also questions from the audience later in the webinar. But for starting right now with some housekeeping rules, not content related, but just technical, the webinar is being recorded, and this recording will be available on the EFI YouTube account and on the IUFRO website. And as already said, please use the dedicated Q&A box for questions to the panelists. Of course, we've prepared a lot of questions ourselves, but it's always much nicer when those different perspectives from our participants are integrated in the discussions as well. And if you want to tweet about the webinar, then please make sure to tag IUFRO and the Superb project. And now I would like to introduce our first keynote speaker for today, Stephanie Mansourian. Yes, that worked with the spotlighting. Stephanie is a consultant at mansourian.org, and she's the deputy co-coordinator of the former IUFRO task force that we're coordinating this webinar, that we have been coordinating this webinar series with. And she will today tell us about a recent publication from IUFRO where she and other panelists today have been involved. And this publication is on the human dimension of forest landscape restoration. And we named the webinar actually after the title of the publication. So Stephanie, you have the floor. Looking forward to your insights. And for everyone in the audience, please make sure to already ask your questions in the chat. And then we can pick them up later.
So thank you very much for the introduction. So I'm very pleased to present this report. That was a collaborative effort amongst 11 scientists, practitioners, and managers. You can see the names of all of the authors here on the screen. And it was a collaborative effort amongst 4 organizations: IUFRO, WWF, the Society for Ecological Restoration, and the University of Lausanne here in Switzerland, with which I'm also affiliated. So firstly, some definitions that we used in the report. So the report focused on forest landscape restoration, which was defined in 2000 as a planned process that aims to regain ecological integrity and enhance human well-being in degraded or deforested landscapes. And by human dimensions, we mean how and why humans value natural resources, how humans want those resources managed, and how humans affect or are affected by natural resource management decisions. So in our case, the natural resource we're talking about is forests. It's also been defined as diverse approaches for using social sciences to understand and improve environmental policy, practice, and outcomes. In the report, we understand human dimensions as relating to the broader emotional, political, cultural, economic, institutional, and behavioral aspects that determine how people relate to forests, both in a positive and a negative way, and how people relate to the restoration process. Now, why is this important? We found that there's a gap in restoration practice, with most of the emphasis being on ecological and environmental issues. So issues such as species, such as genetic diversity, such as soils, such as climate. So those are the aspects where much of the emphasis has been to date on restoration, with much less attention being given to the sociocultural aspects, economic aspects, institutional aspects that are all fundamental human dimensions of restoration. So this is a gap, because forest landscape restoration, and any ecosystem restoration for that matter, operates within a complex social ecological system. So we can't take the forest and just focus on the forest and the trees and the species. Forests are within that complex social ecological system. At the same time, there's no single solution that fits all cases. We can't come up with a recipe that says these are the key points that you need to address. And so to date, there have been limited attempts to understand and guide the integration of human dimensions, be it in forest landscape restoration or ecosystem restoration more broadly. So this is an area that remains weak in practice in ecosystem restoration. And if we take a restoration process, which is what this figure exemplifies, starting with assessing a situation where you want to carry out restoration, to planning the restoration process, to implementing it, etc. Human dimensions are relevant and important at every single stage of this process, as we'll see later in this presentation. So this report was aimed at understanding the diversity of ways in which human dimensions and forest landscape restoration interrelate. It's also aimed to identify and understand important interventions or leverage points, so very much the practical aspect as well, to say, okay, these are human dimensions, but how can they help us to improve practice? So we're trying to identify these leverage points within the human system that can facilitate the restoration process. And ultimately, we were also aiming to provide some guidance. So the audience for this was essentially practitioners that are engaged in forest landscape restoration. And we focused very much, or we kept very much in mind, ecologists and foresters, but not exclusively. And the other audience that is also relevant is academics, educators, and researchers that are engaged in forest landscape restoration. Now, I've put a note here that although the report is about forest landscape restoration, many of the ideas and concepts and guidance that are in there could be applied to any ecosystem restoration. So one of the things we looked at in the report was taking some of the key social sciences, not all of them, but we took 6 key social sciences here to see how they can contribute to forest landscape restoration. And this is what this diagram tries to summarize. So for example, the discipline of economics can help us assess the costs and benefits of restoration. In turn, the discipline of psychology can help us to understand what might motivate different stakeholders to carry out restoration or not. Anthropology as a discipline can help us to better understand the historical context that different communities and cultures might bring to the table when it comes to restoration, and how that can be really important to understand the relationship between people and forests. And so in chapter 2 of the report, what we did was developed a framework that tries to see how the human dimensions interrelate with the restoration process. I mentioned earlier this diagram that's at the center of this one, the 5 key steps of a restoration process, from assessing to planning to implementing, etc. If we embed this in the different scales at which restoration takes place and can be influenced, so from the local level to the landscape, national and global level, all these levels influence a restoration process, even if it takes place very much at the local level. And there are 5 pillars that we've identified where human dimensions interrelate with this process. So the first pillar is the context, and this context, again, is at all the different scales. So by context, we mean the social context, the institutional context. So for example, what are some key policies that influence restoration either positively or negatively? So that's one of the first pillar that is one of the key human dimensions pillars that interrelates with the restoration process. Then the second one is motivations. So especially when we're looking at forest landscape restoration, which is at a larger scale, we're looking at various stakeholders that have an impact on the forest, on the landscape, on the restoration process. So it's important to try and understand the different motivations that these stakeholders might have. And they will all have different motivations for either degrading the forests or, on the contrary, for restoring them. So it's one of these human dimension aspects that's really important to understand. The third pillar in our framework is activities. And by activities here, I'm not talking about specific activities on restoration per se. So we're not talking about planting trees. We're talking about the activities that relate to the human system. So it's activities such as negotiating a common vision for restoration in the landscape, activities such as resolving conflict around land use in the landscape. So those are the sorts of activities that we're dealing with in the human dimensions in restoration. The fourth pillar is influencing factors. So these are issues such as cultural factors, norms, beliefs, power dynamics that influence how people will relate to the restoration process itself, and how people interrelate in the landscape and how that will affect the restoration process. And finally, outcomes. And again, here we're not talking about outcomes in terms of restoration, we're talking about, or rather outcomes in terms of the forest per se, in terms of forest restoration, we're talking about outcomes in the human system. So how the outcomes of restoration, in this case, forest restoration, how it's impacting people in the landscape. So improvements in health, improvements in empowerment, improvements in food security, for example. Those are the outcomes of forest restoration in the human system. Oops. So now just taking a step back, why is it important to understand these human dimensions? Well, we know that there are millions of people around the world that depend directly on forests, and even more who depend indirectly on forests. So it's important to understand that linkage between people and forest and understand where those leverage points are that we can, so that we can make a difference in the way people relate to forests and to the restoration process. It's also people who degrade forests. So again, we need to understand why they do that. What are some of the incentives behind that so that we can try and influence those if we want restoration to be successful. Similarly, people are the ones who restore forests. So in some cases, there are good examples of communities restoring forests because of their importance for their own cultural values. So it's useful to understand why people restore forests, again, to use that as a way of expanding these positive examples. The loss of forests impacts on people. So again, that is why it's important to understand how people relate to forests and how the loss of forests impacts on people and what we can do to improve that those impacts. And the restoration of forests also impacts on people, both in a positive and in a negative way. So that's another reason why it's really important to understand these human dimensions. So if we go back to the key steps in the process, as I said earlier, we see that human dimensions intersect at every stage of the process, from assessing a landscape for restoration to planning restoration, implementing it, etc. And so in chapter 4 of the report, we looked at each of these main steps or phases of a restoration process and considered what are some of the key issues that we need to understand and explore in that stage related to the human dimensions. So for example, in the assess phase, we're looking at who needs to be involved, why and how. what's the current land use in the landscape? So understanding what we have there before we even carry out restoration. Understanding whether there's broad agreement that the landscape actually needs to be restored or not. And also understanding what people expect from the landscape. And a whole range of other issues. I'm not going to go through every single one here, but what we've done in that chapter is identify some of these key issues that need to be considered for each phase. And we then also looked at guidance that exists in other disciplines. So for example, in rural development or in agriculture, there's a whole range of guides on some of these aspects, like negotiations, like engaging local communities. And so we identified some of this guidance that could be relevant for restoration, given that this is an area where there isn't much guidance yet on restoration. And so if you look in chapter 4 of our report, you'll see some of these key issues that are outlined, and then some of the key tools that are related to these different issues. So for example, on understanding what brought the landscape to this state, we've identified a couple of key tools that look at precisely analyzing the socio-political historical context. And actually, this is one area where there isn't that much. So although our report does not aim to be at all exhaustive, here we actually only found a couple of tools on this particular aspect. In step 2, when it comes to planning, some of the key issues that we need to consider are how can we reconcile different aspirations from different stakeholders in the landscape? How are the landscape boundaries negotiated? What are some of the mechanisms that can promote multi-stakeholder engagement? How are the objectives in the landscape negotiated? How can free, prior, and informed consent be ensured and safeguards applied, etc.? And so for the objectives, for example, we identified some key tools that relate to supporting negotiations around boundaries and objectives. In terms of implementation, some of the key issues to consider are how can multiple stakeholders and disciplines be effectively represented and engaged in implementation? How are costs and benefits shared? What conditions are in place that support or, on the contrary, hamper restoration? And how can conflict be addressed? And for this last point around conflict, there's quite a lot of tools that are out there on conflict assessment, on understanding conflict, on negotiating and mediating around conflict. So we've highlighted some of these key tools that could be either adapted or used as they are in some cases for forest landscape restoration. In step 4, that's about analyzing, adapting, and sustaining. Some of the key issues here to consider are, is the process on track to achieve the desired objectives, those objectives that the stakeholders in the landscape would like? And is action against drivers of forest loss and degradation actually making a difference, or do we need to adapt? Have there been any key changes in the human system that may affect the project outcomes? And this is particularly important because restoration is a long-term process and a lot of things might change in the human system. Are modifications needed to the process to achieve desired outcomes? And again, here on this last point, we've identified a couple of tools related to participatory monitoring, which is particularly relevant to restoration. And then finally, in the last step on learning and disseminating, what are some of the key lessons that have been learned? Who is learning and through which processes? That's also really important because we tend to forget about learning until the very end, and yet learning should be throughout the restoration process. And how are lessons shared and communicated? And what mechanisms can facilitate mainstreaming of restoration? And so on lesson sharing and communicating, we've got a couple of tools here that we've identified. So in terms of next steps, we identified in the report some key steps in the short term and some for more the medium and long term. And so one of the key issues would be potentially to have a web-based repository of the tools that we identified in this report. The report is now 4 or 5 months old. So I'm sure there have been some new tools already. And again, as I said, it wasn't an exhaustive overview of tools, but this could be a useful mechanism to have some key tools available for practitioners through a web-based repository. There's definitely a need for capacity building and knowledge sharing. So there's a lot of we'll hear from some of the panelists. I think there's capacity building webinars and workshops that are being carried out in restoration, but this whole integration of the human dimensions is definitely missing, and that would be something that would need to happen. Outreach to different groups that are carrying out restoration. We feel that this, a lot of the work that we've done here could be very valuable for practitioners around the world. And so trying to integrate some of these issues into projects that are being carried out on restoration. And of course, expanding beyond forests. As I said, a lot of the guidance here could be useful for other ecosystems. And then in the medium to long term, we've identified several knowledge gaps. I mentioned in some cases where there's much less tools available, even in other disciplines. Improvement in interdisciplinary collaboration. So one thing that is definitely going to be valuable is not just focusing on the natural sciences in restoration, but bringing in the social sciences. And as we saw, there isn't just one social science, so also looking at, given the particular context, what are the sort of disciplines that would need to be involved for a successful restoration project. And then the framework that we developed in chapter 2 is very useful in terms of analyzing a given project, but also in terms of developing projects. So we'd like to see it applied at these different stages, both in project development and in assessing where a project is at and determining if there needs to be some adjustments. And then also the guidance materials that we've identified, as I said, they're not from restoration, although many of them will be useful as they are. But in some cases, we might need to look at adapting them and making them more relevant to restoration. So I will stop there, and the publication is available on the IUFRO website and at this link. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and a very big sorry for the technical hiccups we had with the Zoom. It's something we need to fix afterwards, and I promise it will not happen again. But thank you for keeping the cool. Thank you, participants, for coming back into the webinar. We still have a lot of inspirational content ahead of us, and also an interesting panel discussion. So stay tuned. Now I would like to, if there are no immediate questions in the chat, which I cannot see right now, I would suggest that we continue with our second presentation, which will be a bit shorter and present the stakeholder engagement strategy in Superb. There will be some content actually that I guess is also responding or connected to what Stephanie just said, because of course the stakeholder engagement approach in Superb has the human dimension as a main target. But before I go into detail, I would like to hand over to my colleague Julia Poszka-Kuchura. Oh, sorry. Can you tell me your family name, please, again?
Poszka-Kuchina.
Poszka-Kuchina will present the stakeholder engagement in Superb now. And then afterwards, we will start with a panel discussion where we will also link back to some of the content presented today. Thank you. Julia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Geshe, and thank you everyone for being here. Thanks also, Stephanie, for presenting your really interesting research and the really critical next steps that you've identified. And as Geshe has already mentioned, like in Superb, we're actually trying to go a bit research some of those dimensions, but also implement them as well in our work. So in Superb, stakeholder engagement, let's say all of the work that's being done by Superb. So the thematic research, for example, we're doing on biodiversity and also good restoration practice, on restoration finance, on restoration governance. Those research streams are embedded in stakeholder engagement, but also, of course, our key restoration work that's happening in the 12 demos. And actually, one of the demos representative, Javier, is also with us today. will be speaking in the panel, is also once again embedded in stakeholder engagement. We also look at it kind of holistically with also communication and outreach. So in our team, we as Prospects Institute are focusing on stakeholder engagement. The EFI, Geshe's team is focusing on communication and outreach, which is also very much linked to stakeholder engagement, together with King's College London. Just really briefly about Prospects Institute, we're a nonprofit based in Brussels, and we specialize in engaging stakeholders in socially relevant decision-making processes. In particular, we work on Horizon Europe projects and sustainability and quite a lot of forestry projects, so including Superb, but also Resonate, Forest Paths, Interseed, Wildcard, and Forwards. So we have quite some expertise in that area. Kind of our overarching goal in Superb is to basically create a powerful multi-stakeholder network and powerful movement for the development, uptake, and upscaling of transformative restoration approaches and actions that are being developed together with stakeholders in our different work streams and also at the demo level. So basically, so we're aiming to ensure to transform forest restoration itself by developing the tools for stakeholder engagement, some of which I'll specify, by building the insights and sharing the insights from our research work, and also by building our own capacities and the capacities of the forestry community to connect in a powerful network that will enable different sorts of actors to exchange opportunities for cooperation, but also knowledge, and other important things. So we work with forest managers, funders, local associations, NGOs, forest practitioners, all of the different target groups, or everybody who's basically concerned with restoration, forest restoration, is a part of our work. So to give you a little bit kind of a more in-depth idea of what we do. On the one hand, as I mentioned, we focus on the demo level. So we support our 12 demo areas in their stakeholder engagement. First of all, in developing their stakeholder engagement strategies, and as part of that, on implementing 3 rounds of stakeholder engagement workshops, which are only kind of the core of their work, but there are other things that they're doing around that as well. What it begins with always is stakeholder mapping, and we use an approach called the Prospect CQI approach, which is targeted making sure that basically everybody who can affect or be affected by a particular process, such as in this case forest restoration, gets a say in the process and is identified, and making the community that's involved in that decision making inclusive. And making sure that you also kind of target not the usual suspects, the non-usual suspects. And the demos have, I think, really did a great job in doing that in the past couple of years. So from vision design to implementation, review, and upscaling, we bring a wide range of different stakeholders together to basically inform what the demos are doing at different stages in their work. At the same time, as I mentioned, we're looking at different kind of thematic areas in our project. And we engage stakeholders from finance actors, policymakers at national and regional level, forestry practitioners, of course, and other stakeholders more directly involved in restoration through informal focus groups to determine, what are the main concerns and priorities of, for example, finance actors or actors who are involved in investing, who are interested in investing in restoration. Short online events to update relevant actors on what we're doing in Superb and the recent emerging findings, and get their feedback on them as well, and hear their side of the story. In-person and hybrid multi-day workshops, which are really meant to be kind of for hands-on interaction, to sharing, for example, experiences on what challenges are we facing, what solutions actually have we brought to the table in our own restoration work, and what can we learn from that together. One-to-one interviews, again, to sort of, see about the priorities and experiences in a more in-depth manner. And we are working towards large-scale networking events, which will bring together certain kind of groups of actors, such as practitioners, finance actors, governance actors, policymakers, to around what we as Superb are developing. also kind of to help them build their relations. But at the same time, also events that would bring those 3 different groups together and other groups as well, because that's what we've been hearing from stakeholders. You know, what's really important is to come together across different types of stakeholder groups to build relationships for successful forest restoration. And some of the kind of the outputs that we have been working on or have delivered is, for example, or working towards the transformative narrative guide. So our partners in FI are focusing on that. So it's a toolkit for basically identifying and developing ways of developing new narratives, for example, community narratives around forest restoration, as a way of bringing in, again, more voices from around the forests into the stories and restoration efforts, and to make what's happening more relevant to the different people that participate. And also in this way, identifying what are some of the issues, some of the tensions around forest restoration, for example, and resolving that. So that's an interesting toolkit that's coming out. Also governance challenging toolkits. I guess, again, our partners working on forestry governance are looking at the different challenges or clashes, for example, in interest around forest restoration in our demo areas and thinking of solutions for these challenges. We will also kind of discuss that together with a broader set of stakeholders to see how relevant those solutions are and how they experience them. Media engagement workshops, public engagement workshops, and as I mentioned, also, of course, like events, we're planning events, for example, with targeted users of some of our research, for example, the policymakers towards whom we are addressing or will be addressing our policy recommendations, practitioners for whom we're developing, you know, specific toolkits, such as toolkits on monitoring of biodiversity, or like carbon levels in the soil, and etc. Toolkits for addressing governance challenges, and seeing what their feedback is, you know, on what is emerging from Superb, so that we can incorporate this feedback and finalize our outputs in the making in a way that would make them have a greater impact and be best tailored to the user groups towards whom they are directed. And so basically, the whole idea of stakeholder engagement in Superb is to increase the impact of our work, and also to help the restoration community, the forest restoration community, increase the overall impact of their work in general by providing the tools for stakeholder engagement, and above all, by providing a platform, a network for building further cooperation and around specific tools that we are developing, but also that other actors are developing. So here you have the Superb communities at the center. It's about connections, research, good practices, exchange, you know, investment opportunities, the upscaling of the work that we're doing in the demos and beyond, about restoration, pre-restoration, so adapting forests to, you know, climate change to come. So I think that kind of summarizes the strategy that we have in the project for stakeholder engagement. And looking forward to your questions later on in the event, and also to discussing with our panelists their take on the matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia, for your presentation. Yeah, I'm sure we will pick up several points from the different presentations in the panel. I can already see that our panelists are very busy answering the questions in the Q&A. You can also leave some of the questions for the panel later. But we had a comment actually to Stephanie's presentation that I would like to read out, and then because it was not a question but more of a comment, and then I will introduce the further panel members for today. So the question came from, or the comment came from Sam Osborne, who said that we shouldn't forget to include livestock farmers as valuable participants in forest restoration, because they have the vast majority of the remaining herbivores and can also provide controlled grazing and browsing services to achieve predetermined and agreed impacts. He said that the regenerative farmers actually have a good knowledge of the different measures. So just I think as a comment or feedback, I'm not sure if you want to respond to this or. Okay,
Yeah,
good.
I think, I mean, we didn't identify and go over all the different categories of stakeholders in the report, but there definitely are many different stakeholders and rights holders, and depending on the particular situation, that you basically have to see who are the key ones that need to be involved. So yes, definitely in this case, it might well make sense.
Okay, thank you very much. Then I would like to introduce the new members of the panel. Yes, I will start with Marlène Elias. She's the gender lead at the Alliance of Bioversity International and also at CIAT. Then I would like to introduce Dr. Michael Kleine. He's a deputy executive director of IUFRO. I would like to also introduce Javier de Dios García, our colleague at in Superb, who is a forest ecology researcher at the Foundation Cesefor and also the representative of Superb's Spanish demo today. And then our final panel member today is Bethany Walder, Executive Director at the Society for Ecological Restoration. Welcome to the panel. Many of you have actually been authors in the for the publication that Stephanie just introduced. And before we go more into the content related question, is there something that you could share that was surprising when you prepared the publication, or maybe some anecdote to start the discussion in a more lighter mode, some anecdote that you could share from feedback or something in the process that was surprising or intriguing to you? We don't need it from everyone, but if one of you could share something, that would be really nice. Who goes first?
I can make a quick comment.
Yes, thanks, Bethany.
I think that there's an extraordinary number of resources available out there, but I think maybe the most surprising thing to me is that nobody had done what Stephanie and she had a core team. I was a tangential team member, I would say. Tangential, but well, let me rephrase it. Your research team, your core team that did like the dug into everything, finding that nobody had collected all this information in one place before and actually said, here's all of this stuff that exists in this space, and then how we synthesize it. People have been talking about human dimensions in restoration for a very long time, but it was, to me, surprising to learn what synthesis hadn't happened yet. And I think that the development of this guide that Stephanie led the development of with these three organizations, IUFRO and WWF and SCR, was a real opportunity to collect this information in one place and to look at where the synergies are and what the lessons are from putting these all together and identifying those gaps, but also seeing that there's been a tremendous amount of work already done. Now we have to get more people to apply it. And so I think that the guide provides both that real deep dive into all those things that are out there and what they mean, but also takes a very practical approach and says, okay, here's what you can do now and how you can apply this stuff. So for me, it was instructive to learn that nobody had done anything like this before, or at least we don't believe anybody had done anything like this before. I hope I'm not misspeaking, Stephanie. And that this type of compendium was critically important to moving this type of work forward in the restoration space.
Thank you very much. And then before we go into the panel, just one more question out of curiosity regarding to the publication. How do you actually convey the message to your target audiences? So how do you reach out to them? Did you already get some, because you want to make this like really practically applicable, which I think is also quite important, because people are looking for guidance, and if they find 1 million sources, they're just overwhelmed. So they need it in a condensed, synthesized version. but how do you inform now your target audiences, like the restoration planners or the people who do the field work? How do you inform them about that this knowledge is available here now at one place? Also asking from a perspective of a communications expert.
I'll just say 2 words, but I'm not the best place to say that because I'm a consultant at the end of the day. But for me, what was critical is having 3 major organizations that are active in restoration being on board and leading this publication, because I think the communities that are behind those 3 organizations are your key practitioners. And now, of course, there does need to be a communications job that I can't lead, but within the 3 organizations, I think we have already a huge base for our audience. So for me, that was really exciting to work with the 3 organizations.
Thank you very much. I think Michael wants to compliment.
Well, I just want to complement this a little bit by by saying that it's a little bit like the question how science and the whole spectrum of ecological and social sciences actually moves into society or creeps into society is again itself a social process. So there is the problem of who takes it up, who needs it, and of course a wealth of information. And like Stephanie and the group has actually compiled this now, is no guarantee that it's straight away being applied. So again, efforts need to be made on very different fronts, in very different regions, in very different contexts to, to enhance understanding of these tools and their applicability in that context. And that, of course, would mean to establish, let me put it a little bit exaggerated, millions of examples and cases and so on, where certain things become common knowledge, which had not been common knowledge before. So these multiplying at local context, with individual contacts, with multipliers, and I get to this a little bit later with facilitation, actually, is one way actually of promoting the application of these tools and methods throughout different societies. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And then I would like to continue with a question that in a way relates to that, and it goes to Marlène. We've been talking about tools, and Stephanie has also touched upon that. But can you, from your practical work, share some examples of tools that you have used to engage stakeholders in your work, so to make it a little more applicable?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. And I think that Julia gave a really good introduction to a lot of tools that, and approaches to engage stakeholders. So that was excellent. And there are many more listed in the guide, of course. But I would say, I guess a key message for me that would be, I'll give a couple of examples of tools, but it would be also that it's very much about not just the tool, but who's involved in the process, and then how the tool or how the process is facilitated, that matters. And so really thinking about issues of representativeness and also of creating inclusive spaces. So if we're thinking of stakeholder engagement, really finding, and there are, documented strategies for creating these inclusive, facilitating spaces in an inclusive way. So very much thinking about that as well. But then in terms of specific tools, well, some were already presented, but definitely doing a good stakeholder analysis through stakeholder mapping and doing that in a participatory way. So there was a comment about livestock farmers and so on. So it really is about finding out, who needs to be at the table. That's a very, very critical and formative step. And having a lot of participatory input into that is really critical. And also that participation being maintained. So starting at the very earliest stages of the process and being maintained throughout the process is very important. So there are several tools around stakeholder mapping and stakeholder analysis, where you're basically identifying, who are these key stakeholders. And also, what are their interests? Are they shared? Are they competing? If they are competing, where are their points of convergence, or how can competing interests be reconciled? So those are very, very important steps, and there are some tools for that. And then, yeah, I think one important one too that tends to be a good icebreaker when you can have something that's quite visual and where people are able to get in with sort of, drawing and holding pens and so on, can be quite a nice way to put different stakeholders on the same, sort of level when they're engaging with one another. And there are several tools that lend themselves to that as well. And one of them is, for example, landscape mapping, where people would actually be drawing aspects of their landscape, and then you'd have questions to prompt discussions around the visuals that are being created. So those are just some examples, but really thinking about who and how, I think, is, and when, sort of maintaining that engagement is really critical. Thank you.
Thank you, Marlène. Of course, also considering the needs of the stakeholders. So to try to respond to the needs of the stakeholders in your approach. You've touched upon it already a little bit, Marlène, the different interests, and the stakeholder engagement can also, of course, mean that people have divergent perspectives on the restoration. So I would like to ask the panel a little bit if they can share some experiences from your work where you've been dealing with diverging, or maybe also like really maybe also conflicts in the process. And I would like to specifically ask Javier and also Michael, and then the others can complement. Javier, do you want to go first? Did you face diverging, not just different, but diverging stakeholder interests in one of your events or your processes?
Well, not really confronting. That's what I was expecting. We are carrying out a restoration project in El Bierzo in the northwest of Spain, and it's we are restoring the habitat of the brown bear. So I was expecting, we carried out 2 workshops in the area with stakeholders, and I was actually expecting more confrontation, but it was not really so much. So there were farmers, there were beekeepers, there was the regional administration present, also forest rangers. There was a lot of attendance, and yeah, I don't know, I could give some like the main conclusions of this the workshop, or maybe if Michael, you want to go ahead with some other example.
Well, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Geshe, please.
No, Michael, you go ahead. I comment afterwards.
My starting point, or the starting point of some of the IUFRO projects with science institutions and education institutions, for example, in Malawi and Sri Lanka, of course, a completely different context than Javier was just mentioning in Spain or in the European context. But one realization definitely is that, of course, the local context and the pressing needs for restoration is decisive at the very beginning. In Malawi, it's food security at stake because of climate change and overutilization of the land, overpopulation, and so on. And that's a common ground where stakeholders in these areas are actually really coming together, saying, what to do now? We don't have water, our plants are dying. So there is a common ground to start discussions and actually applying these social tools for participation, for reconciling, and so on. Because the social process itself does not always mean there is a good ecological outcome. Yeah, because it can be different interests, and they can be so diverse, they can be so diametral to each other that, of course, there is no regard. But here, in this case, in Malawi, it's definitely the interest by farmers to have trees on the farmland, to conserve moisture, to conserve soil fertility, agroforestry system. So that's a good common ground to work together as number one. but of course, the tools in the toolbox Stephanie and group has put together is a good actually source now to expand on these social participatory processes and apply them in this context. However, what we realized is that these processes don't run on their own. You need facilitators. So we had a training program for facilitators who are actually those trusted local people, who have access to the different stakeholder groups. And these facilitators drive and moderate these processes so that actually stakeholders feel somehow safe, not only to talk to each other, but the facilitator would bring in scientific information, new ideas from outside also, together with local knowledge, with local experiences. So one needs to initiate a kind of and that's probably the hardest thing at the beginning, so that these processes can start. A completely different situation we have in Sri Lanka, for example, in the wet zone in the south, where is a forest reserve completely degraded, and the forest department is restoring this together with IUCN for biodiversity conservation and enhancement. But here, the stakeholder engagement is for the surrounding communities, not to encroach as they had done in the past, that the tea plantations are not extending into the reserve, by improving livelihood in terms of spice gardens, in terms of improved tea growing and so on, to protect at least the area and then to restore with native species and so on. So these are different discussions, but again, you need facilitation within the communities, within the stakeholders. And the Forest Department in Sri Lanka actually has done a tremendous job in preparing their own staff to be these facilitators at local level. So, this facilitation and using these tools, I think, is for me and for us in IUFRO a key mechanism actually to drive restoration discussions with some practical outcome. Thanks, but I'm talking too much already. Thanks. Back to you, García.
If I could make a quick comment.
Oh, yes, please respond to each other. I just wanted to encourage you. You go first.
So speaking from personal experience on a collaborative decision-making process prior to working at SER on a forest restoration, I participated in a stakeholder group for about, 5 or 7 years on forest restoration. And I think one of the things, and I think that both Javier and Michael referred to it, and so I just want to use that as an example of one of the issues that needs to be addressed right at the beginning. In this forest restoration stakeholder process here in the United States, we were discussing restoration on public land, on national forest land that's owned by all the people of the United States. And the Forest Service had not made clear what is the purpose of the outcome, what is the purpose of the restoration. And so we spent years debating, like literally, and so you asked if there was conflict. I've been in a very conflictual process where some members wanted the outcome to be for biodiversity and wildlife and nature, like what Javier talked about with the brown bear, and others wanted the outcome to be for continued production, so for continued logging. And that was and so, Michael, you also talked about that if your objective is food security or if your objective is this. So I think one of the lessons and one of the things to think about, and one of the things the facilitator has to focus on, and one of the things that the community of stakeholders have to come together on is what is the outcome, because then it affects how you design and implement your restoration and what the engagement and the role of the people are and what the human health and well-being and livelihood and other outcomes are. And that, I think, is one of the places where the biggest conflicts tend to occur that then ripple into all of the other discussions. And so in the human dimensions context, one of the first things we have to come to is, can we agree on what the purpose for this restoration is? Is it for production? Is it for food? Is it for climate? Is it for carbon sequestration? Is it for? And if we can come to that agreement, and including that it's for multiple things, and ideally, most restoration is for multiple outcomes, then I think it's we have more opportunity to have that very inclusive and less conflictual process. But I think there have been many, many conflictual restoration processes out there in the world, and there will continue to be, and there are different lessons we can learn from them to reduce that conflict in the future.
Thank you, Bethany. And that's exactly how I would like the panel to go, that you respond to each other. And I can see you, Julia, already raised her hand. So just to emphasize, these also like practical experiences that you made, and the like views and perspective from different world regions and processes. I think this is really helpful and makes it very tangible and applied. So I really appreciate that. And I think Julia might also want to share some experiences, and then we move on with the next question.
Yeah, thanks, Geshe. Yeah, exactly. I'd like to build also on what Bethany was saying, the importance of, establishing the purposes or the purpose of restoration, but also the really important notion of, exploring the scope for common ground and also limitations, of course, to this. So just an example from an event that we organized last February around the nature restoration law, and let's say the incoherencies and complementarities between the different policies and legislations in the European Union affecting forest restoration. So this was more an event at the policy level. So for, people from the European Commission, also government representatives from member states, but also people, for example, from the forestry industry and the conservation nonprofits. And here, I think, of course, there were, very different perspectives raised and quite a lot of kind of conflictual perspectives. But what we think really helped are the kind of the hands-on interactive sessions where these people were brought together in mixed groups, several mixed groups. And they were asked to, first of all, kind of establish together, one common goal that they could see for the nature restoration law implementation. So they were given a couple of choices, and then they could basically think, okay, we all actually think that we can contribute to this one goal in forest restoration, kind of connected to the nature restoration law. And then also see how can they, as an actor, be it as an industry group or as a commission or as a, policymaker working in the environmental industry of Bulgaria, how can they kind of contribute towards this goal, and what has been their experience in collaborating with others towards this goal. And then basically, based on that group work, to share their recommendations. Okay, this is the goal we're working on. This is how we can actually all kind of come together and work towards it. And this is some of the good practices that we already kind of had in this area. This is how we collaborated, with the industry in our country and etc. And I think people really appreciated this opportunity to really sit together, not like in a big conference, where the debate is really political, but to kind of think in a very kind of solutions-focused way and to hear each other out in small groups. And then, of course, to kind of, compare what has actually emerged from those different working groups. And that's also like a method that we use in quite a lot of our engagement events, to really get to people to think together, sit together, focus on the common grounds and also on the outputs. And I think, the common grounds thing, what Javier was saying, is actually an important, interesting example, because there you sort of think that there's no common ground, and you perhaps do restoration based on this assumption. But when you actually do stakeholder engagement, the stakeholder engagement actually helps you clarify that as well, like in that case, I guess it helps you realize that actually there's more common ground than you perhaps thought, and also more of a common purpose that you thought. And then, okay, here's really a great opportunity to work together, which is something perhaps you didn't consider before the workshop.
Thanks, Julia. So to focus more on the progress than on the kind of final outcome, which will be a meeting in the middle anyways. I really like that you focus also on the facilitation, and that you emphasize the need for facilitation, because that's exactly, for instance, what Julia's organization Prospects Institute is doing, that they are facilitating those dialogues and also collaborate with the local experts, because, and you mentioned the training for the local experts, that's also a crucial thing, that the people who know the region, who know the concerns, who know the local condition, that they also are part of the facilitation team, which is also how we're approaching it in support. But Michael, you raised your hand, and
thank you. I think just taking it from Bethany's and Julia's contribution just now, what should we do if it takes, as Bethany says, years to agree on a restoration purpose. On the other hand, as Julia said, that there is now a huge stakeholder consultation, also from the policy and from the industry, in the European context, from the industry level and so on. It's all very important. Actually, one needs to take it from both sides. One could also go, and if there is no agreement on a large-scale restoration purpose now, to establish, as we put it, future resilient landscape examples, and bring it on the ground, because sometimes showing and seeing is believing rather than only talking about it. So if there are some innovative stakeholders who say, well, these 10,000 hectare here or 5,000 hectare here or 20 hectare here agricultural land, we will do this and show this. And that's one of the projects also now in Malawi and Sri Lanka, where these examples are being set and established on the ground, simply to showcase and to have dialogue as examples in the real world, rather than to, sorry to say, only to talk about it, which is rather very, let me say, far away from many different realities of stakeholders, the farmers, the foresters, and others. So establishing examples wherever possible can also help to that something becomes more, let me say, a better land use, a more ecological sound land use becomes more common knowledge, or aspects of become more common knowledge. Riverbank restoration and cleaner water and better soil management. No? So from both sides, no? from bottom up as well as from top down. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. And I see this is a super active panel, which is exactly what I was hoping for. I just don't know if Javier or Bethany were raising their hand first, because the hand I can see is the same color as the Cesefor logo. So, okay.
I can be super quick and just say,
yes,
we agreed to disagree because it was going to take so long to get to the point where you'd have to actually make those decisions, that we basically said, we just need to move forward with the restoration and we'll deal with it later. And, you know, but you have to build that trust to be able to do that. And I think that's one of the things that comes into play. So, but I think it's very similar to what you're saying, Michael, which is you just got to get out there and do restoration. You also have to do it within the constraints of what the formal legal context is that you're working in. So you can't give stakeholders a space and say, what do you want to do, and not put the legal constraints, and then they come back and they say, we want to do something that doesn't fall within the institutional framework. You can't do that, right? So you've got to give people the ability to succeed.
That should also be part of the facilitation process, to bring in that knowledge, right? Because that's crucial to move on and to really implement. Now Javier, and then also Marlène.
Yes, it's just a small point. Considering what Julia was saying before, that it was very, let's say, considered very critical that there were these small groups of stakeholders to discuss during the workshops, for example. I think that was very important. Also, something that Stephanie mentioned, the initial analysis of the stakeholders that you bring together to these workshops, I think it's also very important, so that it's balanced. There's a gender balance too. I think that's very important for you to work.
Thank you, Javier. Marlène, since Javier was also mentioning it, maybe you also want to share a little bit about your experience on because that's also your field of expertise, on your experience of addressing the gender dimensions in as part of the human dimensions.
Sure, thank you. If I can just make a quick point on the conflict issue, I know we could go on and on, but just to say that I think we're talking about these restoration processes as sort of, they're a moment in time, the way we're, approaching them. But of course, these stakeholders have been there, they've been interacting. There's a historical, there's a history behind this moment in time. So that sometimes is where the nerve is too. Some conflict is not only, it's not only due to a restoration process that we're coming into or that's being initiated at a certain moment, but it's very much rooted in a historical relationship. So I think that's the messy complexity and reality of it all, is that, you know, in some ways that cannot be ignored in this. Otherwise it becomes really problematic at some point. And then, yeah, thinking of governance, so not just, you know, conflict, but how it really, what are effective governance mechanisms that preempt and that mitigate and that can work through conflicts. So not just as a kind of activity, but as a governance, you know, as more as a governance mechanism, I think is something to think about. And then having also within, if it's a project or an intervention, some kind of grievance redress mechanism. So when there are also, you know, fundamental problems happening, they can surface and they can be addressed. And then a last point on this is just around, you know, stakeholders are not, they don't all have the same stakes, if you will, in the sense of dependence also on the landscape. And so really making a distinction also among sort of rights holders and those who are whose livelihoods are intimately intertwined with the landscape and what their priorities are. And, you know, putting that also in perspective in relation to those of other stakeholders. So I think those are all some issues to consider in thinking about conflict. And priority setting and visioning and so on. And then of course within that there are gender dimensions. So moving on to your next question. I mean, gender dimensions are central to everything that we've, you know, that Stephanie presented on human dimensions. Of course, humans are diverse, you know, within local communities, the interests are not necessarily shared, even within, you know, even within a household. So very much thinking about how gender shapes how people relate to forests and relate to how dependent they are, how they use forests, what knowledge systems they have around forests, and how that affects, of course, their experience around restoration. And that will run through every pillar that Stephanie presented of the framework. So whether it's on motivations, whether it's the context and the land tenure issues, whether it's the outcomes, what outcomes are prioritized, how those are distributed, all of those would be shaped as well by gender. So very much something that has to run through the way we approach the entire process, recognizing that diversity. And I'll just say as a last point, it's not just gender, of course, it's really, you know, that diversity of people who are sharing the landscape and who will have different rights and responsibilities and experiences with relation to the landscape, and gender being central within that, but certainly not the only important social aspect that needs to be considered. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marlène. The kind of consideration of different social aspects and predispositions that also links to my next question, which would be related to the kind of social science research around that. But Stephanie, you can just respond to this, and then I can ask my question afterwards.
Thank you. No, I just wanted to emphasize this issue of diversity, and when we're dealing with human dimensions, we are dealing with such significant diversity that we really stayed clear of providing guidelines because of the uniqueness of every single situation. So even, you know, when we're talking about indigenous communities are extremely diverse, whether we're talking about indigenous communities in parts of Congo or whether we're talking about indigenous communities in Ecuador. So for all these reasons, we really cannot have something that's very prescriptive and strict guidelines on how to integrate human dimensions in restoration. What we opted for is looking at tools that can help us deal with some of these aspects of integrating human dimensions, but not saying this is how you have to do it in a prescriptive manner, because we are dealing with such diversity when it comes to these aspects.
Yeah, this is also how I understood the approach of the book, that you offer some kind of good practices and that you offer some tools, but that you always emphasize that those are context dependent, also content dependent, objective dependent, etc. So this is also, I think, what makes our work so inspiring, but also what makes it so so challenging. Before I move to the more kind of science-related questions in the end, I would like to ask Javier a little bit from his experience, how they are integrating the human dimension into their restoration work, to have this like also applied knowledge from Javier, and maybe also something else from Julia, and then we will move to a different topical part of the discussion. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm working in the SUPER project too. So we have done a stakeholder engagement workshop. Last one was in February. It's the second one that is done in the project in this area. We're working in the northwest of Spain, and also we have also acted as facilitators to conduct surveys to local populations in Castilla y León to know the attitude towards restoration projects and the protection of the brown bear. Yes, this is more or less what we have done. We have participated in other actions and also asking for authorization letters to local municipalities, also letters of support from associated partners, and
how do you get the stakeholders involved? How do you tackle the human dimension and the diversity of stakeholders that have an interest in your demo?
Well, we did this analysis. We used this this method that Julia was explaining before,
and it worked for you.
Yes, I think it did work. So, like, basically, we analyzed. We looked for the most interesting stakeholders for what we were aiming for. We looked for farmers, we looked for beekeepers, and all the people that would be important for restoring the habitat of the brown bear. And I don't know, maybe it's this is also like a case specific thing, but in our case, for example, fires are very recurrent. So every year, 2,000 hectares are burnt in our area. So there's like a common aware that this has to be so that people want to find a solution also to these. Bears are also like a species that people generally like, unless they are very, very numerous. But in our case, people are quite, I don't know, we feel like it's a species that people generally like. Yes, so maybe it's a very specific case.
Maybe some things are easier for you than for others, which is great for you.
Yes.
Okay, we have some really good questions in the Q&A and also comments in the Q&A. I would like to pick some of them and not promote the participants to speakers now, because this we don't want to risk any more technical glitches. But there is some input from our colleague Marcel Hunziger in the SUPER project, and he's announcing, related to the stakeholder perceptions, that in SUPER we are working on a survey that assesses the acceptance of restoration and also the factors influencing the acceptance of restoration amongst societal stakeholders. And we will present the results definitely also in a forest restoration webinar next year. But just for you to know that this is coming, this is also something that might be relevant for some of the people here in the room. And then there's the question to, I think, everyone on the panel who was involved in the publication, whether there are monitoring, also from Marcel, whether there are monitoring attempts to evaluate actually which activities or strategies show best effects And that also then links to the question that I already announced, which goes into the social science research around all this. So maybe we can put those two together, and maybe not sure if you, Stephanie, can have a go on this question.
Yeah, thank you. To answer Marcel's question, I'm not aware of any monitoring attempts to evaluate which stakeholder involvement strategies show best effect. Now, my response would be, well, you need different stakeholder strategies in different locations anyway. So I think the strategy will need to be adapted to the location and to the stakeholders you're dealing with, and therefore it's going to be quite difficult to compare potentially apples and oranges. Sorry, Geshe, your second part of the question was?
My second part of the question is whether this would be an interesting topic for social science research. And that also links to back to your presentation where you were looking into the main social science disciplines that are contributing to restoration, and maybe to kind of link these two together, because the social science research around the human dimension of forest restoration is really crucial, and I think something you are all concerned with to a certain extent.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, there's increasing research from social scientists on conservation more generally, and now gradually in restoration as well as one component of the broader conservation field. I think historically there's been maybe more criticism by social scientists, and now maybe there's more of a proactive, positive input, an attempt at bringing the natural and the social sciences closer, recognizing that at the end of the day, we're working in a social ecological system and that the two are needed alongside each other. Now, again, social sciences, as I tried to explain in the presentation, there are many, and we only superficially explored 6 and how they can contribute, but there are books out there, and obviously there's loads of research in multiple social sciences. For example, one that we didn't look at all was history, and yet the cultural history, the colonial history, there's all sorts of historical aspects of a human landscape that are really important and that will impact on restoration potentially. I mean, there's historical conflicts that might not be very obvious to someone coming in to try and attempt a restoration process, but that will eventually come out and will affect the restoration process if they're not understood and somehow not necessarily resolved, because some of these historical conflicts might certainly not be resolved overnight by a restoration process, but there needs to be that understanding and then some work around to achieve restoration objectives. So yes, definitely interest and growing recognition of the need to bring social sciences into restoration, for sure.
Thank you, Stephanie. And just some reference to Superb. In Superb, actually, we have prepared for all the demos historical narratives that kind of capture the history of the region and history of the restoration and the development of the forest, and like also some stakeholders that were concerned with this site in the past 100 years. So it's something that we've been trying to do to a certain extent in Superb. And yeah, I think we might also, it would be interesting to also have a forest restoration webinar on that, because the historical dimension is often not considered enough, actually. Yeah. I think Javier was next, and then Michael.
Yes, also I agree with what Stephanie was saying, that trying different strategies is a very good way. I'm sorry, I'm not a social scientist. I work in forest ecology, so my experience is limited to other speakers. But in for example, this workshop we did, we tried like different participatory techniques, and some of them people were very shy and did not want to share their opinion with, and then when we tried, for example, these small groups, also we tried using the app Menti to ask people, even people who were a bit older or had less experience with technology. Actually, we received very good feedback from everyone. So I think it was very positive.
Yeah, thank you, Javier. That links to the need of also interdisciplinary approaches. Maybe Michael, from the IUFRO perspective, can kind of add a little bit on that.
Well, I think I just wanted to highlight here that if, and we need to do that, as all the speakers have agreed also and emphasized, to bring these natural science and social science together. But we should not stay on that general level. What does it mean if we talk about restoration? The different stakeholders, this is a different meaning for them in this brown bear project, in a Malawian project, in a project with industrial forestry. It's a completely different, and we need to take, for many of the stakeholders, the fear that restoration would mean a huge loss, a huge disadvantage. So we need to be much more specific if we talk about bringing these things together, and not leaving this on the more general level, because even the current discussion on the new EU regulations, sparks huge emotional debates at the farmers, at the foresters level in many different European countries, partly, in my view, unnecessary, because if you would define actually what they are doing now and what little bit they need to change, or a little bit to work towards more, let me say, sound management of the landscape, to change certain things gradually, then suddenly things become palatable, for the different interest groups. But we need to insist on the specificity and not just to stay general. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. That's a very important point, and that also links to the narratives that we develop around the activities, and not saying that and focusing on the kind of on the objectives, of course, and on the outcomes and how positive, how far they would be positive for the different stakeholders, but also developing narratives that emphasize not the big efforts that people have to make, but the little step that they can do into the right direction. And then it would be a completely different debate. I agree. And this is, of course, also more heated because the media reporting, etc., around it is kind of focusing on the controversy rather than on the potential solutions and the common ground that people definitely have. Julia, yes, you can continue, and I can also see that Bethany and Marlène want to say something, so this is getting really inspired now. Yes, go ahead, please.
Thanks, Geshe. And of course, the interesting work you're doing in the narratives also involves the mapping on social media of the different perspectives that are being shared on social media around forest restoration by King's College London, which are perspectives which actually, a lot of us have never heard before. There's so much discussion there that, usually doesn't reach forest restoration efforts. But I'd like to pick up on the point that Marlène raised before, and kind of the long-term nature of social relations around forest restoration in particular, and actually many of the other points raised. So what we're also doing at the demo level is helping the demos develop a stakeholder engagement strategy. And the emphasis there is to basically move towards continuous long-term relations with their stakeholders. Now, some of the demos have already built these relations. They're engaged with a diversity of actors for years already, and are really kind of, negotiating with them, mitigating the different interests. But for others, it's just really a start. And I think that's really key, is to kind of gradually move in that direction. That would be, what transformative stakeholder engagement for forest restoration would mean, in the case of Superb and the demo strategies. Because what do you then achieve? On the one hand, it's, what Marlène was talking about is making sure that there are mechanisms in place for redress, but also kind of the moderation and mitigation of different interests. And also the recognition that you will have different interests and kind of pain points, and that, it's not always perhaps easily resolvable, and it will make restoration more difficult. But at the same time, it's not always, from our experience, kind of, people don't dare in restoration projects all the time to really look at this and really to try to address it. So that's something that we're trying to kind of encourage to bring in for this continuous stakeholder engagement, to kind of take that difficult road. And at the same time, to make people more like realize, different groups of people, their stake in forest restoration, right? Also what I guess Michael was talking about, you know, like these different understandings of what does it mean, because our experience is also in some of the demos, quite a few actors, you know, don't see it as relevant to them, although they live to the forest, although they're impacted by, you know, the economic opportunities that are there. So this kind of long-term stakeholder engagement actually, you know, makes a lot of people realize that, oh yeah, we also have a stake and an interest in then kind of, you know, helping preserve the forests. You know, and I guess also to kind of sit down and try to, you know, reach compromise, for example. So that's kind of like our approach to supporting the demos and building these like long-term relationships that kind of look conflict in the face on the other hand, or not conflict, but and also kind of you know, make people realize that they have a stake in it. And I know Marcel was talking about, and what they're doing is again creating also, I think, recommendations on again how to mitigate and address conflicts in restoration, not just, you know, neatly resolve, but what to do to sort of moderate them. And based on the demos, but it's very much kind of you know, it's not kind of clear-cut advice for everything, but it's approaches that could possibly be tailored to other settings.
Thank you very much, Julia, and thank you also for mentioning the social media research, because that's also an important part of kind of finding out what the narratives around the restoration sites are, and how those can be integrated into the narrative developed by the restoration implementers, to kind of respond to the different needs that are also the issues emerging also in the online sphere, and then also in the and then also in the, of course, in the sphere, in the active kind of restoration planning sphere. But I think I'm not sure if Bethany or Marlène are next. Okay,
Go
Bethany.
ahead,
Pointing
Bethany.
to me.
Yeah.
Okay. I know we're over time, so I'll try to be super quick. I want to make just 2 or 3 brief comments. One is we've really focused very heavily on stakeholder engagement in this discussion, and we need to remember that human dimensions is about more than stakeholder engagement. And so it does not stop and just start at stakeholder engagement. It's the whole restoration process, and I think that's super important for us to think about. And the other thing that there's been a lot of discussion about participatory stakeholder engagement. I think it's important to remember that participatory means not just information and conflict discussion, but also actually participating in the process of developing, designing, implementing, monitoring, doing the restoration. And in that context, and I really appreciate that Julia used the term transformative, because I was planning to use it as well. I think it's also important for those of us participating in this discussion and those who work in restoration to recognize that restoration in and of itself is a transformative, participatory act that changes the human relationship with nature. And when Michael talked about some of what the long-term needs are and where all this objection is coming from restoration, one of the things we need to do is get people out there just doing restoration. When people go out and they do restoration, they walk around with smiles on their faces for I mean, literally, I have people email, they're like, I walked around with a smile on my face for 5 days after I went and participated in this restoration volunteer event. And so if you look at the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration and its vision, it is a world where for the health and well-being of all life on Earth and that of future generations, we have restored the relationship between humans and nature by increasing the area of healthy ecosystems and putting a stop to loss, fragmentation, and degradation. SER has had this same thing, reestablishing an ecologically healthy relationship between culture and nature in our mission for over 15 years. So one of the things we have to think about is that humans are part of nature. In the human dimensions of forest and landscape restoration, in the human dimensions of ecological and ecosystem restoration, humans are part of nature. And part of what we want to do is use restoration, the participatory act of restoration, to transform that relationship and to recognize and celebrate the knowledge that already does exist on how to live more sustainably with nature. And I think that shouldn't get lost in the human dimensions discussion. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Bethany. And I think we can talk a little longer because we had some breaks in between. So we still have 5 to 10 minutes, I would say. And yeah, thank you for these kind of emphasizing these different elements. And I think Julia had a direct response to this, but if yeah, okay, then if it's fine for you, Marlène, then Julia can say something, and then we.
Thanks, Geshe. Thanks, Marlène. Just really quickly, and yeah, thanks, Bethany, for kind of mentioning this, because indeed, like, one important thing about the stakeholder workshops, for example, in the demos that we're organizing, they're in a sense an act of participatory restoration, because what we've seen across the 12 demos is that these discussions bring in really valuable knowledge and really valuable advice on how to strengthen the restoration that's actually going on in the demos. You know, that's actually the main output of these workshops, rather than, you know, like the conflict resolution. As like Javier said, you know, there was actually less tensions and conflict that they expected. What was there is a lot of knowledge, perspectives, you know, okay, maybe you should try this, you should try that. Or also, have you thought of connecting to this actor? You know, we know that somebody else in this area is doing this. You should kind of, you know, hang out, let's say. So I think that's definitely what we're aiming for. And that's definitely been one of the most valuable outcomes of the engagement process. You know, I know it's a limited aspect, but at least for the engagement process, it's been really participatory and brought a lot of really valuable insights for the restoration work.
Thanks, Julia. And also to emphasize that this is really about creating ownership, and for people to really take part in the activities, and this way also kind of, for many, I think, overcome their frustration about climate change and global change and all the challenges that we're facing, and kind of being part of something that actually reconnects human with their nature in a way. So I think this is the kind of transformative active that we also in Support believe we can also tackle with stories. So telling stories around that, stories that embrace the people, and also make people kind of remember that they are a part of nature, and that nature is not something existing outside of them. Marlène, please, you
yeah, thank you. And
contribute.
I mean, it seems like it should have ended. That was, you know, so much has just been said on which we could end this. But I would just say, I mean, the emphasis on stakeholder engagement, I think for me, it's not that, well, it's not stakeholder engagement is not an activity. It's a principle. It's a way that we know that these processes have to operate. Those people who are most impacted, especially, I come back to kind of the differentiation among stakeholders, but those who are most impacted, who are living on the lands, have to be at the center of these processes. And if that's the case, human dimensions will be they will be addressed, because people know that this is about their livelihoods. It's not about the environment out there. It's about how they live their lives, how they interact with nature, how they interact with forests. So I think if we really are able to place those people at the center of the process, and not in a way that is sort of, again, this moment in time of a project or an intervention, but if, you know, in terms of thinking, where are there structures that favor this kind of, you know, full and effective participation and leadership and control of these processes by the people who are living on the land? I would say, you know, let's also think of where are there already deliberative structures that are legitimate in their lives, that matter to them, where they make decisions about how they use their lands, about how they interact, you know, about their governance structures and so on. And we really have to be a lot, I think, more intentional about linking these processes into those structures, rather than creating, you know, parallels. It's not that there's no room for also new spaces and platforms, and linking up the local with, you know, national and international. And so that all has to happen as well. But I think a much more intentional way of working also within existing structures where decisions are made and so on, can only sort of favor the process and the integration of human dimensions into the restoration process. Thanks.
You
Yes,
muted,
you're muted.
Geshe.
This already sounded like final words, or as a kind of not a complete summary, but touched upon several points that we discussed. Is there any further comment from the panel? Anything that you still would like to share? Some key takeaways, or maybe also if there are none, then what are the next plans, the next steps for moving forward after publishing this amazing guide? What are your next steps as a group? Because you've been working together for such a long time in this group, and one can really see how you collaborate and exchange ideas and how you inspire each other. So what are the kind of next steps for your work? Not sure who wants to go first, or who wants to summarize.
Well, for IUFRO, if I may just come in here as a large network represented in many different countries with many different education and research institutions. Of course, it's to promote these human dimensions in all its forms, from policy to stakeholder engagement and so on. With particularly in the program I'm coordinating, the special program for development of capacities, in workshops and in knowledge sharing events, online or physical workshops over the next years, whereby just to recall that even the practitioner's guide in 2017 emphasized, of course, the process already, and not putting in the forefront the human dimensions, but it is already part of the whole process already there. Nothing needs to be changed there, but to use these tools and to use more social science, let me say, aspects and tools for actively improving these systems and making people aware, that would be the task of IUFRO, at least the intention in some of the programs to promote that. Thank you.
Thank you. And then maybe finally, how is the Society for Ecological Restoration taking this forward?
I'll try, but my internet's really unstable. So if I...
Okay, seems that it doesn't work out. We have some severe technical issues today, but it was nevertheless a really inspiring discussion. I've learned a lot, and
I drop again, just ignore me.
Okay, yeah, wonderful. I think it's time to come to an end. We've touched upon many things that I think were really relevant, starting from how to work with diverging perspectives of stakeholders to what the tools really are to integrate the human dimension, to what we can do to see the human dimension in a holistic way, starting from involving people in the entire process, and then defining an objective that fits with the local communities, to how this can be accompanied by research. And thank you very much, Michael, also, and the others, for stressing the need to also promote the social science around this area of restoration. That is, I think, a crucial area for successful restoration, because if we don't involve the local community, if we don't have the human dimension, we don't have those humans who actually maintain and support the long-term implementation of the restoration when a project has ended. So yeah, that's so to see the long-term perspective, not only in terms of the forest and the ecological perspective and the healthy and resilient forest, but to also see that that there are socio-economic systems around it that also need to be maintained and resilient and interconnected with the landscape. So thank you very much to all the panelists. Apologies again for the technical glitch. We will figure out afterwards what happened and then make sure that this never happens again. Thank you for staying in the staying so focused and entertained throughout the webinar. We will have our next forest restoration talk in October. We are currently figuring out the topic. It might be old growth forests. So for those who are interested, that's what we're currently discussing. And stay tuned and follow us on the website, and make sure to check out the publication that we've been discussing a lot today and use it as an inspiration for your work. Thank you very much and have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Everyone.